Hi everyone, this is Katie from Moonflower Moments. I had a viewer ask me yesterday how I tend to generate topics for my readings. And I thought this was a really genius question because I think that my practice and how I used to generate topics for my readings has changed really significantly. And right now it's kind of coming to a point where I'm doing something a little bit unconventional, and I think that it deserves to be shared. So thank you to the viewer who asked me that, because that definitely inspired me to think of this topic in more detail and to really just kind of pinpoint down exactly what I'm doing. So when I first started reading tarot, I used to pull oracle cards, and those oracle cards would set the tone of the reading and would be the topic of the reading. So if I pulled, say, for example, self-expression from Southern Gothic or Southern Botanic, then that would be the topic of the reading. I would explore aspects of self-exploration or self-expression. And I think that's something many people do. I also used to pull spreads from this book, which I very much enjoy. This is a really great book if you just need some help creating spreads. But I think primarily now I'm letting my decks pick what types of questions I ask. So what do I mean by that exactly? Okay, so what I like to do is I sit down on my tarot table and I ask myself, what kind of deck do I want to work with? And just last week, I had a very strange urge to pull out Tarot of the Moon Garden. And I say it's strange because this is a deck that I typically work with in like January and February. As I'm planning the garden, I like to kind of see what types of foliage are present in these cards and try to see where I can fit that kind of foliage into my own garden, or at least that's how I used it in January and February. Right, but the garden can be a larger metaphor for life. So though I use this for planning for the garden, I realized a couple weeks ago that I could just use this deck for planning, period. Because everything is just like fully chaotic, and it's like this beautiful chaotic mess of a garden, I feel like this is like a visual representation of brainstorming, right? Where you throw everything onto the page in your free writing process, and you look at it and take a step back and see what sticks. So when I feel the urge to pull out this deck in my life, I know that there is something that perhaps I need to brainstorm or plan, and I sit down in my journal and I start with a question: what is in the planning stages of my life? I might jot down some notes for it, and then eventually, based off of this deck, which is associated with planning, I realize, hey, I pulled this deck for a particular reason because there is something really important in my life that I need to plan out. So in that way, I sort of let the decks choose what types of spreads I build or what types of topics I work with. A similar thing can be said about the Mystic Faerie Tarot. I've been using this deck a lot this summer because to me it just feels like the sun is shining in the garden in its fullest capacity. And so when I sit down to pull decks or to pull cards, and I think of this deck, I ask myself, what in my life have I executed? What in my life is in its fullest capacity? What in my life is at its fullest level of prosperity? And so I know that when I'm attracted to this deck, that's probably the type of readings that I need to do. It's stuff that, you know, is in relation to happiness and abundance and just beauty. Same with my very beloved Mushroom Hunters Tarot. I've been thinking about this deck quite a lot recently. Like a lot. I go through phases where this is the only deck I use for a while and then I just forget about it. And I think a large part of it is seasonal, but when I say to myself, hey, I haven't used the Mushroom Hunters Tarot in a while, I feel a calling in my gut, I feel my intuition telling me to reach for this deck, that usually means that I'm going to do readings that typically revolve around decomposition and recycling. So I know that when this deck comes out to play, it is time for me to look at what I'm recycling in my life and what sort of cycles are coming and going and are cyclical in nature the same way that a mycelium is. Mushroom Hunters is not the only deck. I have like a very specific set of like themes I work with, but it's also the Zombie Tarot. So sometimes I sit down and I have just a really wild and crazy calling for the Zombie Tarot. This is a deck that if I lost in a fire, I would instantly have to replace, because this is one when the calling comes to me, I know that I need to look at interpersonal matter. So because this explores the relationship between zombies and humans, it shows the power dynamics of one group of people working with another group. And so I know that when this deck is calling to me, there probably is something interpersonal in my life that needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at. So it's another example of how I let the calling of the deck determine what types of readings I'm going to do. Similarly but differently, I also do something with my plant and animal decks that I think is kind of unique. So I have a lot of different plant and animal decks. This is Animal and Botanic, or Animal and Botanical. And while my garden doesn't feature all of these plants and all of these animals exactly, I do have, for example, these look like little green, or rather gray hair streaks. And gray hair streaks, their host plant is oak trees. So I find a lot of like little butterflies that look similar to this, not quite exactly like this, that live underneath the outskirts of my oak trees. So what I'll do if I'm feeling like the calling to work with Animal and Botanic, it probably means that I'm feeling the calling to work with animal energy. So I will search in my garden, like kind of like a little scavenger hunt, and find something that reminds me of a piece of the imagery on the card. And in this case, it would be the gray hair streaks. And I would sit underneath the live oaks, hopefully coming across a gray hair streak. Sometimes I see them, sometimes I don't. And then pull cards asking myself, what can I learn from the gray hair streak as my guide? And this is something that I've done pretty much every single day during the summer. So in a way, I let the deck kind of get me in the realm of, hey, I want to work with animals, so I know that I want to create a spread around that, but I let the card imagery in particular pick what type of animal I'm going to work with, or what type of plant I'm going to work with it, just based off of the visual similarities. And I wanted to add that I do this when I'm reading for friends too. So if a friend come over and she wants me to read like on a specific topic, I will pick the deck for her that I think is closely aligned. But if she just wants a general reading, what I typically get people to do is just, I show them my basket of decks, and I have like 3 large baskets, and I tell them to pick whatever deck calls to them. Now keep in mind that all of my decks are in bags. So like all they're doing is picking the bag. But I firmly believe that like the decks we need to work with, the tools we need to work with in that moment are ones that call to us. And so even though they can't see the deck itself, they can still feel the energy ruminating from the bag, and they know what kind of deck that they need to pick. And so I had a friend of mine who I would never normally do a reading for her on this topic, but my friend pulled La Femme Erotique. And YouTube, I'm not showing erotica, I am showing a deck of tarot cards based off of vintage photography. But viewers, I am about to show something that's a little not safe for work. So I'll show you a few of the cards that are a little safer for work. So she pulled this deck, and I was like, hey, like this is the deck that I tend to use for like questions regarding like sexuality and sensuality. Are you okay with me reading with you, for you, on that topic? And she told me yes. She said it was fine. And so I think that we ended up having a really incredible reading that was quite deep, because I let her pick the deck. Did she see the deck? No, all she could see was the bags. But I think that the tools that we need will call to us when we need them. And it turned out that she was in need of some guidance in that department. And so I think that this deck was calling her name in that way. So letting the decks pick the types of readings that I do is not just a practice that I apply to myself, but it's a practice that I apply to other people as well. So the reason that I'm able to do this primarily is because I have a more sizable collection, but also because I've spent a lot of time thinking through like what decks would work best with certain topics. And so Boticelli is one that I had to recently sit down and kind of reconcile with. So this is a little bit different of a topic, but it's sort of related, right? Like what happens when you get a deck and you're not exactly sure what kind of readings you would like to do with it? You know, it's hard to let the deck pick what kind of topics you're going to explore if you're not really quite sure what the deck's energy is. And so what I decided to do with Boticelli is I just sat down and I wrote like 5 or 6 different phrases that came to mind while I was looking through the imagery of the deck, just like doing a little bit of stream of consciousness writing. And I discovered that this deck reminds me a lot of antique shopping. And so of course to me that brought to mind prosperity. So even in the cards that are a little bit like more troublesome, such as the 3 of Swords here, you can tell she's like yanking him by his hair, like pulling him away. She still has this star that's in her hand. So it's a little flower that looks like a star right here. And then the bottom below them, even though they're kind of in a field of mud, they still have flowers that are blooming. And so I think in every capacity, this deck represents prosperity. It's the prosperity even when we're at our dimmest and darkest times. So when I feel Boticelli call to me now, because I've made those personal associations, I know, hey, I really need to think about prosperity work and how I can acknowledge the prosperity around me, the abundance around me, and work within these energies and these capabilities. And there's one more thing I do too, which is separate from what I've showed you. So previously I've kind of discussed how I let the decks pick the topics, because I firmly believe that when the decks call to me, they're calling to me for a specific reason, and decks are suited to a specific type of work for a specific reason. But I also sort of like to work a little bit with bibliomancy to create spreads as well and to pick topics. So recently I was reading Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood, and I paired it with Somnia. So Cat's Eye is a book that is just incredibly despairing and heartbreaking. So essentially this young girl, she's kicked out of her friend group and is tormented and bullied by her friends. And the book is written as her as an adult who is looking back on her experiences as a child and trying to make sense of them and try to make sense of the cruel world. And so there's a particular passage that's read with like a very heartbreaking tone. So after this girl has gotten bullied, she goes to her dad's office, and he's a professor. He studies biology. And she sees a bunch of taxidermied animals and insects around her, but she talks about the stench of the taxidermied animals. And so what I decided to do was, it was my book. I write in my books all the time. I'm definitely one of those people. I decided that I was going to circle the key words in that passage that were really resonating with me and do a tarot spread around that. So taxidermied animals, I mean, taxidermy is the act of preserving something that should have already passed, right? So I asked myself, what am I preserving that needs to move on? And what is the stench? What is the effect of me clinging tightly to something, to a cycle that that should have already ended, that I should have already let go of? And I can say that when you're working with a book that is deeply symbolic in nature, that pairing it with tarot is one of the greatest ways to generate content and to generate spreads. You know, because obviously I was attracted to that passage to begin with. You know, I circled it. I felt like it was something that was really beautiful, something that was really symbolic, and something that, you know, I could just ruminate over. If I'm attracted to that passage, that probably means that there are ideas within the passage that I need to explore. And I think the same thing could be said about music, right? Like if you sit down and you have a song that you really enjoy and you listen to it on repeat, repeat, repeat. I have a song that I love to listen to, and my friends and I were laughing about it the other day, because I am in a happy marriage and I have been for about 4 years now. And the song is about like a toxic breakup from when you're a kid. And it's funny that I have such a fixation on this particular song and these particular lyrics, because that's not the stage I am in my life, right? But I could technically listen to the song, write down the keywords and the phrases that ruminate with me, and do a tarot spread with it. I think that there is a reason that we are attracted to what we're attracted to, whether that be music or books or particular types of decks. And if we find ourselves feeling interested in certain topics or certain things, then I think they're worth exploring for us to learn more about ourselves. So in general, when I sit down on my reading table, I really many times don't know what I'm going to be reading, but I do love to take inspiration from what's around me. I talked a lot about this in my reading table reset series, which I'm so sorely overdue for another one. I'm going to leave a link down in the description box below of how I use plants and the plants in my garden to build spreads and generate topic creation. But I think that for me, it really is about following my heart and following my interest and trusting myself that what is capturing my attention is worth my attention at that moment. So I really thank the viewer who asked me this question. I thought it was a unique one, and I'm going to add this video to my Dissecting My Tarot practice number 4. And if you want to see the rest of the videos like this, in which I systemically go through my tarot practice and ask myself the ifs, ands, and hows, and whys, and whats of it, feel free to look at the rest of the videos below. So I thank y'all so much for supporting my channel, and I hope to see you next time.